Occasionally, not very often, we see in our news reports or we hear from news around the world people who are forced by others, by threat of violence or other means, to worship something that they do not want to worship. Occasionally we see terrorists or extremists trying to force people to convert to a different religion or something like that. That's what, of course, we see in Daniel chapter 3. We've been looking at Daniel these last few weeks to see how it is we can live in our society, standing upright and strong in our faith, while being caring and loving for those around us who don't know Jesus. And in Daniel 3 we see Nebuchadnezzar. He builds a statue. He says that everybody has to bow to this statue. And if you don't bow, you're going to be thrown into the furnace. And of course we read the story. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego refuse to bow to this idol that Nebuchadnezzar has made. And that of course provokes one of the most memorable responses that we see in the Bible. Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego in chapter 16, they say this: King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we're thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hand. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold that you have set up. As I've said occasionally today, we hear of similar events in our world. The threat of death to force someone to convert to a different faith or worship something that they don't want to. But we don't often face that pressure in Western Europe. The threat of death or all of those things, it's not something that we face. It's much more subtle than that. It's undoubtedly true that Satan still wants to get us to worship other things, but he's being much more subtle in the way that he does that. The idols that are put in front of us would appear to be harmless, but anything can become a false god for us. Whatever captures our imagination, whatever gets our attention and forces us to give it our allegiance is an idol for us. And we have to be watching for that. The aim of the devil is to get these three friends to worship another god, an idol that Nebuchadnezzar has made. And it's still his aim for us, though using a different method. But we see also in the book of Daniel another threat or another pressure on worship. You see, on those three, it was to try to get them to worship something different, another god. But with Daniel later, in Daniel chapter 6, we see it's to try to stop him worshipping Yahweh. The story is this: the enemies of Daniel are trying to get rid of him. He's been in power for a long time and they don't want him to be there anymore. But they're unable to, because they can't find anything in his life to bring him down. His life is full of integrity. The only way they can do it is to get the law changed so that the thing that is precious to him becomes illegal. So they get the king, in this case Darius, to create a law that means you can only worship the gods of Babylon. You can only praise the gods of Babylon. And of course, Daniel is only wanting to worship Yahweh, only wanting to pray to Yahweh. And of course, we know the story. The threat is, if you don't pray this way, if you pray the other way, if you pray for gods that are not Babylonian, you'll be thrown in the lion's den. Of course, Daniel does what he always does. He returns to his house 3 times a day. He opens his windows, faces Jerusalem and prays to Yahweh. He could easily have justified a compromise. Oh, I'll just close my windows so they don't know. Or I'll just play quietly or pray in my head so they don't know. And the same pressure is on us today in our Western society. It's all right to practice your faith as long as it's done within acceptable limits. If Daniel had closed the doors and kept it quiet and not made it public, he would have got away with it. But he knew that he had to continue what God had called him to. And so our society today puts limitations, or tries to put limitations on the way that we worship. We hear this thing about our faith is personal. And it's, you can believe what you like as long as you don't tell anyone else. Or don't preach in public. Or it's all right to practice your faith, but as long as it's within the acceptable guidelines created by our society. But as Christians, we live in a society that is hostile to our faith. There's pressure to worship the gods of this world, but there's also pressure to compromise our worship of Yahweh, to not create offence to those around us. It's striking to me that the reaction of Daniel's three friends, Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego, and Daniel himself, is the same in both circumstances. They all continue to worship, and they're all prepared to face the consequences. They know that if they refuse, their life is in danger, and yet they did. They didn't start a campaign or a petition or cause a ruckus or whatever. They just continued to worship. In fact, they respected the right of the community that they lived in to make its own laws. That's a right given by God, actually, to Noah. But they did not obey those laws when it meant compromising their faith. We need to learn from this. God has given our nation, our government, the right to create laws. He put our leaders in place. But where they create laws that are not godly, we can campaign against them when they're being in the democratic process. But actually there comes a day when we just simply have to obey God and face the consequences. And that day may come in my lifetime, it may not, but there are pressure upon us to compromise who we worship and how we worship, yet we must stand and worship God as he has called us to. Just as we go into discussion right now, I wanted you to discuss these three questions. The first one, what subtle, or perhaps not so subtle, gods are before us which would distract us from worship of Yahweh? Second, what pressures might we experience to compromise our authentic worship of Yahweh? So what is it that might come to try and make our worship compromised? And lastly, how can we help each other to maintain the worship of Yahweh in the face of the direct and indirect pressure from our society? Thanks for listening. See you next time.